simple answers of saying, well, misogyny is the problem. It's like, no, let's look at the expansion of British colonial powers and connect the dots. The way in which the early RCMP controlled and dominated large amounts of territory here in Canada was through the use of strategic violence to scare populations, right? That's how a small number of Mounties were able to control large amounts and steal large amounts of territory. But that's exactly the same tactic that in the book I talk about how in high-risk relationships, ones that often end in homicide and attempted suicide, that type of violence, it's a strategic form of violence that's very different from other forms of intimate partner violence. So if you're asking me how I situate myself as a white person in an abolitionist movement, it's like, well, I need to account for the ways in which my ancestors brought structures of objectification and possessiveness seen both through the ways in which the land itself was objectified and stolen and possessed by structures of white colonial power, and then making sure that we don't lose that from the conversation when we're talking about how we tackle gender-based violence, especially when possessiveness and logics of objectification are part of what underpin the type of severe violence and homicide that we do see.
As a society, we are failing to address the systemic factors that are most critical to ending gender-based violence. Governments have imposed their neoliberal agenda, transforming the violence against women movement from a radical transformational change movement to service provision focused on individualized treatment and efficiency through criminalization of gender-based violence and professionalization of the work that you've already mentioned. Consequently, gender-based violence is treated as an individual level problem, with money provided for shelters, law enforcement, and targeted intervention services. Funding has increasingly become tied to the state through legislation and judicialization, both impacting how gender-based violence is defined and understood and shaping the types of initiatives that receive funding. After numerous consultations with organizations in the violence against women sector here in Quebec, the province has made various announcements regarding funding targeted at addressing domestic violence. In May, the Quebec Justice and Public Security Ministries announced it would inject over $1 million per year for 5 years for the SPVM to create a new specialized unit for consultation and investigations in matters of domestic violence. Just last Wednesday, the same ministry announced that it would begin requiring some domestic violence offenders to wear electronic tracking bracelets beginning next spring. The $41 million program, which will be rolled out gradually across the province, is said to be designed to give the victims a better sense of security. Considering these examples, could you speak on the importance of addressing the ways neoliberalism, criminalization, and professionalizations are intertwined to shape the kind of work made impossible when it comes to ending gender-based violence?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we could all talk about that for 5 hours. The way in which the funding structures and the expectations, the narrow expectations that sort of outline and define where we're able to work and how. And so, you know, of course it always gets cited, well, a woman every 6 days in Canada is killed by her intimate partner. But yeah, police have killed a civilian on average every 6 days in 2020. So it's paradoxical to me that we're still talking about funneling money to police as a way to address intimate partner homicide. So these problems emerge in a number of ways. One, police have been the only people in our communities who are doing risk assessment on scene when there's like a situation of violence where neighbors or perhaps the survivors call the police. Police are not trained to understand the specifics around what kind of violence is high risk and what isn't. And so they miss things. They miss things on the job because they're not trained, they're not experts in intimate partner violence. So shelter workers and those who work closely with survivors are much better able to understand who's at highest risk. But of course, they're not the ones who make decisions about safe housing. They're not the ones who make decisions about whether or not a charge is going to be laid. So for example, I use this, I tell a story in the book, and it's a really common one, where in certain forms of intimate partner violence, in coercive control relationships, as they're called, something so small as an abuser leaving a bouquet of flowers, like on the hood of your car or on your doorstep, can be a death threat in the context of the relationship. That's something that only the survivor, if they're lucky enough to survive that kind of relationship, would understand. And so funneling money to police not only places Black and Indigenous women at higher risk for criminalization, which is what happens when we make the police responsible for responding to family violence. In Australia, for example, they brought into place what's called coercive control laws. Coercive control laws are laws that are strategically designed to try and account for those forms of high-risk family violence that I talk about in the book. But what they found was, over a 6-year period, every single Aboriginal woman in that region of Australia who was murdered by her partner had been identified as a perpetrator of violence in that relationship. So her self-defense had been criminalized prior to her death. And so funneling money to police is this narrow expectation that the only way to achieve safety is to work through the existing criminal code or to amend the criminal code. But the neoliberal approach to trying to secure safety for survivors, we see it in the shelter system as well. Organizations are under a lot of pressure to work within the carceral punitive model, and folks are facing a lot of liability and a lot of risk to their employment, and also it's heavy, difficult, trauma-exposed work when you work within the shelter system. And so the abolitionist question is, so if you have policies in your shelter that when you do a risk assessment, you have to call police in this particular circumstance, you know, for whatever your policy structure is in the NGO that you might work in the shelter you might work in. You're putting yourself at risk professionally for losing your livelihood if you step outside of that, right? And so it's a tricky thing because on one hand, we want to be critical of the way that professionalization in the industries that work to support survivors and to address violence against women has been really negative because it's fostered white supremacy within the movement, it's foreclosed any conversations around complicity, the structures of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and how that has led to vulnerabilities. But we also want to be mindful of the fact that folks within those sectors have really good experience and expertise. So teasing out how we can secure safe and equitable and just livelihoods and to respect the expertise of folks who work with survivors, but at the same time tackle the conditions of their work where funding streams are tied to particular interventions that always have to rely on police. That's a tricky thing. I wish I had more answers about that.
I want to take it a little bit further. In the words of former political prisoner Susan Sachs, "My feminism does not drive me into the arms of the state, but even further from it." Could you comment on the consequences of the mainstream violence against women movement's uncritical collusion with the state? What role can or should feminist nonprofits in the violence against women sector play in implementing abolitionist strategies to end gender-based violence?
I mean, I think the outcome of the collusion of the nonprofit sector and those who work in this sort of the anti-domestic violence industry, the outcome of the collusion is that we have not been effective in reducing rates for family violence. We have absolutely been ill-prepared to tackle any social or political causes of increasing rates of femicide, intimate partner homicide, domestic homicide. So, you know, we're constantly trying to play catch up after violence has happened. And because these sectors are so under-resourced, we sort of work under this like neoliberal scarcity model where we feel like we have to choose between giving services to survivors now or working on prevention. And it becomes very difficult to step back and question why we have to make that choice at all. I do think that there is a role for nonprofits, and there is a role for folks to have paid employment in organizations that support survivors. But I think that those organizations have to provide, so one, refuge from racism. There need to be services and centers that are only there for Black, Indigenous women, racialized women, because there is racism in the shelter sector. And I think that that's one way that we can start building organizations to provide safety. I think that there's some really interesting models that happen. So like the laws that govern how nonprofits work are different province by province. But if you sit down with a collective of organizers and figure out how you can set up organizations to try to resource the work of ending family violence, sometimes you can use a cooperative structure. In Nova Scotia, you can set yourself up as a society, or there's different kind of like models that you can use within this neoliberal framework of the state, so that you can try to funnel some resources to have paid work. Because I think the outcome of a lot of the really great Black feminist writing about transformative justice has been that a lot of white activists, white anarchists in particular, have taken this really neoliberal approach to interpreting that work. And now the expectation is that everyone should be ending gender-based violence for free on their own time with no training in unsafe ways. And I don't think that that's okay, and I don't think that that's right. And what I see over and over again in my community is my colleagues, my collaborators, my allies, specifically Black women who are experts on these issues, are consistently asked to work for free in accountability circles. And I think that is not sustainable, and that replicates a disrespect for the labor and expertise of folks who are best poised to be making decisions over where we should spend those funds. So I think it's going to be a constant fight to figure out how we resource that work, but then also try to push back on being co-opted and beholden to those neoliberal funding models that force us to work in ways that go against our values.
I really appreciate the way that your work has a structural approach that kind of gives us a bird's eye view and a historical understanding of where gender-based violence comes from in our contemporary moment, but then also is interested in the kind of nitty-gritty practical ways that we can try to prevent and intervene in cases of domestic homicide. And I think that intervention is particularly important, and you mention it in the book, because within abolitionist discourse and transformative justice discourse, the sort of quote-unquote extreme cases or more violent cases are often not really talked about. I know that even myself, when people ask about murderers, what about rapists and murderers? And my immediate answer is always that they're already among us. But that's in so many ways an insufficient answer, in as much as it sometimes really forecloses a real reckoning with the reality of that violence around us. And so one of the sort of interventions that you make is really highlighting the impact that it makes to distinguish between those forms of violence, between intimate terrorism and other forms of gender violence. And so you talks about the different types of intimate partner violence. You also mention a website, dangerassessment.org, that offers a kind of questionnaire that helps to kind of determine what type of violence is at work. And you really show that it's important because in some cases, the typical interventions that a transformative justice model might offer are actually ones that might put the victim or the survivor in danger, that might put bystanders in danger. And so there's really a kind of specificity to the approach that's necessary in those different types. And so I wonder if you could talk about those different types and how one might distinguish between different types of intimate partner violence, and then in those cases of intimate terror, what does safety planning look like? What are abolitionist strategies that can still be implemented in those cases where the danger of the victim and bystanders being killed is very real? And so I was wondering if you could also share some sort of examples, concrete examples of what those tools might be in those cases.
Yeah, so the work on the typology of intimate partner violence comes from, that's Johnson's work. And so, we often talk about intimate violence as if it's like a monolith, right? And it sort of erases any differences that there might be. And so I think that there are dangers to putting forth like an uncritical typology of domestic violence, because we're just gonna like nitpick all day, like, oh, well, this is dangerous and that's not dangerous. But I think that what's important to note is, so Johnson says there's situational couple violence. Situational couple violence is what we see most often. We probably all know someone who's been in a situational couple violence abusive relationship. These relationships can be really dangerous, so violence can escalate. It can lead to homicide. So this is the type of violence we see that comes from, it's exacerbated by addictions issues, stress, pre-existing mental health conditions, learned abusive behavior in the home. This is all stuff that we already know about. But then there's intimate terrorism or coercive control, something that Evan Stark has also written about. And that's the one that I'm most concerned with in the book, because that's the one that most often leads to domestic homicide. And so I think one of the things that I'm really arguing for is that, so if we want to create abolitionist strategies in our communities to deal with family violence, we need to know what kind of violence we're addressing, because a lot of the tools we already have, like accountability circles and ways of working supportively with the survivor and someone who's being violent, those work really well in situational couple violence, and that's what we see most often. But what we don't yet have, and I'm sad that we don't yet have this, because like Insight and Critical Resistance released a joint statement in 2001 asking for this, is an answer to what do we do with the really dangerous people in our communities. And the dangerous people are what we call intimate terrorists in a relationship. And so that intervening as community members in those relationships is really tricky, because, well, one, it's not going to be someone that we're organizing with, most likely, who's in one of these relationships, because if you're in that kind of relationship, you probably have disappeared from public life in a lot of ways. So it's likely going to be someone that we know as a friend, or we have some other kind of connection to, that might not be as connected or embedded within our community. They're already isolated. But any kind of intervention is incredibly dangerous in those relationships. And what makes it extra tricky is that those relationships don't always have physical violence, yet the person who is the target of the controlling behavior and the coercive behavior deeply knows in their bones that their life is at risk. And again, that's where the criminal justice approach fails us. What do you do? The cops are going to show up and be like, oh, so he left a bouquet of flowers on the hood of your car? And then a survivor's like, oh no, but he didn't know where I was, and the bouquet was there because he wants me to know that I know that he's watching. Like, it makes you sound crazy when you're in one of those relationships. It's really difficult to explain. And so I think that that's a tough question. So, okay, so we know that there are certain relationships where the risk for homicide is really high. We know that the dangerous person in that relationship is likely to be suicidal. We know that they're likely to face some kind of occupational crisis. So either they have recently lost their job, they're struggling to find work, they're under some kind of extreme financial pressure, right? We know that this person may or may not have used physical violence, but they're surveilling or stalking, you know? And those are all the things that are in the danger assessment checklist. And so as movements, as neighbors, as friends, as families, we need to know the risk signs so that we know the level of danger that the survivor is in and that we might be in when we try to intervene. And so, you know, it's a tricky question, especially because in the region where I live, there's a lot of guns, you know, and in rural communities, it makes it extra tricky because access to firearms is a strong predictor of intimate partner homicide in a coercive control relationship. So we're going up against someone who's really dangerous and someone who has a gun. But I think that knowing the risk factors, knowing how dangerous it is, means that we're going to organize differently and we're going to respond differently. We're going to be able to assess our risks and figure out, okay, so like how sneaky do we have to be about contacting the survivor? And what kind of messaging do we need to send to them? Like, okay, this is top secret. We're not going to do a call out on Twitter if you tell us what's going on, you know? So like, we're going to be able to communicate in ways that'll help us navigate those dangers if we understand which situations are risky and which aren't. Because I get very scared when I get community requests from people to join an accountability circle, and then they describe what's going on, and I'm like, oh my God, this is actually a really dangerous situation. Because I think that if we're going to do this work, it has to be just, and it has to be safe. And I think that we can't be martyrs in ending family violence because we are teaching ourselves how to care for each other better through the process. And so I think that developing, networks for safety, whether that